My parents called us together for a family meeting. Out of nowhere, my dad looked me dead in the eye, handed me a piece of paper, and said, "You owe us for raising you." At first, I thought he was messing around. But then my mom chimed in with, "Be grateful we're only asking for this much." That's when I realized they were serious. So I reached into my bag and pulled out my own invoice. And when they read it, the color drained from their faces. And believe it or not, that wasn't even the worst part. I'm 34 now, and if I had to sum up my relationship with my parents in just one word, it'd be transactional. Not like I had to do chores or take care of responsibilities, that stuff's normal. Most parents expect that from their kids. But in my family, I figured out early on that nothing came without strings attached. There was always a price tag on everything. I've never been the kind of guy to ask for much. I learned better. If I wanted something, I had to earn it or make a rock-solid case for why I deserved it. I had to prove I was useful. I had to show that I was worth the investment. My younger brother, Brian, he's 29, never had to deal with that. I don't think it started as outright favoritism. At least, I doubt my parents saw it that way. But all those small things started stacking up. If I wanted a new pair of shoes, I had to stash away my birthday money or keep a flawless report card. But when Brian said he needed new shoes, Mom would just go out and buy them. If I asked why, the answer was usually something like, "He needs them for soccer," or "You're better with money, you can wait." That kind of logic followed me into my teens. At first, I convinced myself I didn't mind. I liked being self-reliant. I liked knowing I could handle things on my own. But as I got older, I started to see it for what it was. It wasn't about independence. It was about expectations. My parents just assumed I'd find a way. They expected me to struggle and figure it out. But Brian? He was the delicate one. He always needed saving. And it wasn't just about money, it was about how we were treated overall. When Brian forgot about an assignment and flunked a test, Mom would wrap her arm around him and say, "It happens to everyone." But when I missed one homework deadline, just once, Dad looked at me and said I was being lazy and needed to grow up. When Brian got caught drinking at 17, Dad just chuckled and said, "Boys will be boys." When I came home 5 minutes past curfew, I got grounded for 2 straight weeks. I never said a word. Complaining wouldn't have done a damn thing. But there's one memory I'll never shake: my 16th birthday. I'd been working part-time for close to a year, saving every cent I could to buy a car. I knew my parents weren't going to help, so I was ready to handle it myself. Still, a tiny piece of me held onto the hope that they might pitch in just a little. Maybe they'd match what I saved or surprise me with an old used car. But a week before my birthday, Brian turned 14. And my parents, who had never even hinted at helping me with a car, bought him a brand new gaming console. I shouldn't have been caught off guard, but I was. I didn't say anything, but my dad must have noticed the look on my face because he said, "We'll talk about a car in a couple of years, once you've proven you're ready for that kind of responsibility." That's when it hit me like a punch to the gut. They were never planning to help. They didn't look at me the same way they looked at Brian. So I stopped hoping. I kept working, saved every dime, and bought my own used car at 17. I put myself through college. I got out of that house the minute I could. Meanwhile, Brian coasted. He dropped out of college twice. Quit job after job. And every time he screwed up, Mom and Dad would show up with cash, explanations, and another chance. I never asked them for a thing. Not even when I was barely making ends meet. Not even when I could have really used a break. I kept my distance. Truth is, I probably should have cut ties completely. But part of me, the foolish part, still thought maybe, just maybe, they'd come around now that I was grown. That maybe they'd finally see me differently. Then, just last week, I got a text from my dad. "Family meeting. Sunday at 3 p.m. Don't be late." I almost ignored it. I mean, I'm not a kid anymore. I don't live under their roof. But something about it made me curious. We hadn't had one of those family meetings in over 10 years. So I went. First thing I saw when I walked in was Brian, slumped on the couch, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. He barely even looked up when I came through the door. Mom and Dad were sitting at the kitchen table with these weirdly serious looks on their faces. Something felt off right away. "Sit down," Dad said. So I did. And for a few seconds, nobody said a thing. Then Mom pulled a piece of paper from a folder and slid it across the table toward me. I picked it up, not sure what to expect. Honestly, I had no idea what they were up to. But when I looked at that page, my stomach dropped. It was an invoice. A long, itemized bill. And they weren't joking. I thought maybe I was misreading it at first. The numbers didn't add up in my head. The words kind of blurred together. Room and board. Food. Utilities. Medical stuff. Even gas money for giving me rides when I was in high school. The total? 80500. I let out a quick laugh, not because it was funny, but because I honestly thought it had to be a joke. You're kidding, I said, setting the paper back on the table. But they weren't smiling. No, we're not, Dad said, with this calm, almost teacher-like tone, like he was explaining math to a little kid. Raising a child isn't cheap. He went on, we gave you a place to live, food, and education. Now that you're doing well, it's time to give back. I just stared at him, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Mom leaned in, her voice gentler but just as serious. And be thankful we're only charging you this much. If we added up everything, it'd be a lot more. I glanced over at Brian, hoping he'd crack a grin or say something sarcastic. But all he did was shrug, like this was totally normal. I couldn't believe it. You're actually serious, I said. Dad let out a sharp breath through his nose. He was losing patience. You're successful. You've got your own business, a good life. We've supported you for years. It's time you returned the favor. That's when I felt this burning, bitter feeling rise up in my throat. You didn't support me, I said, slow and steady. I worked my way through school. I moved out on my own. I've never once asked you for anything. Dad's face changed, his jaw tightened. And that's exactly why we knew you could handle this, he said. And that's when it all clicked. They didn't think they were asking me for money. In their heads, this was something I owed them. Like I was some investment they were finally cashing in on. I looked back down at the invoice, scanning through the breakdown. A lot of it was ridiculous. One line said, general parenting costs, $20,000. But the one that really caught my eye was near the bottom. Loan to cover family emergencies, $17,000. I frowned and pointed at it. What the hell is this supposed to be? I asked. Mom shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable. That's from a few years ago when we needed help. You pitched in on some mortgage payments, remember? Oh, I remembered. They'd called me out of the blue, practically in tears, saying they were in a rough spot and just needed a little help. I wired them the money the same day. Didn't think twice. That wasn't a loan, I said quietly. I gave you that money. I never once asked for it back. Dad waved it off like it was nothing. Well, that just shows you had more than enough to spare. I felt my fingers tighten around the edges of the invoice. So let me get this straight, I said, keeping my voice low and steady. You're actually expecting me to pay you back for things every parent is both legally and morally responsible to give their child? Mom let out a long, dramatic sigh like I was being unreasonable. You're missing the point, sweetheart. This isn't about the money. She said it like she was being patient with a child. It's about appreciation. We worked so hard to give you a good life. This is just your way of showing you value all we did for you. I almost laughed again, but there was nothing funny about it. Appreciation? For what? For being treated like some sort of liability while Brian got everything on a silver platter? For all those years I was constantly reminded that I had to earn what he just got handed? I'd spent my entire life trying to measure up, trying to prove I was just as worthy. And right then, sitting at that kitchen table, staring at that ridiculous sheet of paper, it finally hit me, I never would be. I took a slow breath, steadied my hands, and slid the paper back across the table. No, I said simply. Dad's jaw tightened like he didn't quite believe what he was hearing. What did you just say? I said no. I stood up. I'm not paying you. Mom's face went stiff. Her lips thinned. We're your parents, she said, her voice sharp now. We spent years raising you. This is the least you can do. The least I can do? I let out a dry, humorless chuckle. I was a kid. You chose to have me. You don't get to send me a bill for existing. Mom opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her face turned red with frustration or embarrassment, I couldn't tell. Dad, on the other hand, leaned back in his chair with that same disappointed look he always gave me growing up. We always knew you were selfish, he muttered. And that right there, that's what made something in me snap. Selfish? I repeated, my voice low and sharp. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Took me a second to find what I was looking for. Then I turned the screen toward them. Their eyes flicked to the screen. What's that? Mom asked. I met her gaze. My own invoice. It was something I'd put together a while ago, not because I ever planned to use it, but because I needed to see it for myself. To have it in writing, black and white, just how much they had taken from me over the years. Not loans. Not temporary help. Money I'd never see again. The $17,000 I sent them for mortgage payments when they were in a panic. The savings account they emptied to help Brian get back on his feet. The inheritance from my grandfather that magically vanished before I ever saw a dime. And the total? Let's just say it dwarfed the little invoice they handed me. Mom's face went pale the second she started scanning the numbers. Dad's fists curled tighter on the table. Mom kept reading, her eyes jumping down the screen, her lips pressed into a tight, thin line. Dad didn't bother. He glanced at it once and shook his head like he was already done with it. This is different, he said, his tone clipped and cold. I raised an eyebrow. How? Mom shifted in her chair, clearly scrambling for a decent explanation. Because we're your parents, she said, like that answered everything. The money we used, it was to support the family. You weren't struggling. You had enough. I exhaled through my nose hard. So let me get this straight, I said slowly. When you spend money on me, the basics that every parent is supposed to provide, that's a debt I have to repay. But when I give you money without strings, without hesitation, that just disappears into the void. Dad's face darkened. Watch your tone. I ignored him. I was 18 when you took that inheritance, I said. You told me Grandpa didn't leave me anything. But later, I found out he did. Mom flinched. Her lips parted like she was about to deny it. But she didn't. Maybe she knew she couldn't lie her way out of it this time. She turned toward Dad. He let out a long breath and rubbed his temple like he was the one dealing with nonsense. It went toward the house. Mortgage, repairs, things you benefited from. Benefited? I repeated, laughing dryly. I moved out when I was 19. I never saw a cent of that money. But sure, let's pretend I benefited. Neither of them responded. And then finally Brian decided to speak. Why are you making such a big deal about this? He said, annoyed, like I was being dramatic. It's not like you're hurting for money. I turned and looked at him, really looked at him. There he was, draped over the chair like he owned the place. Wearing a hoodie I knew Mom had bought him. Still living at home. Still driving the car Dad paid for. Still getting money and second chances handed to him like candy. Of course he didn't see the problem. I took a breath and forced myself to stay calm. This isn't about the money, Brian, I said. It's about the fact that they genuinely think they're owed something for doing the absolute bare minimum as parents. Bare minimum? Mom echoed like I'd slapped her. We gave you everything. A home. Food. Clothes. I held up my hand. Stop. Just stop, I said. Do you hear yourself? You're listing off basic responsibilities like they were favors. Like you went above and beyond. I looked between the two of them. I didn't ask to be born. I never agreed to some kind of contract that said I owed you money just for raising me. Dad's mouth was set in a hard line. You act like we're strangers. I stared back at him, unflinching. Aren't you? Because no real parent would sit their kid down and try to shake them down like a debt collector. Mom looked away, blinking fast like she was holding back tears. And for the first time, she didn't look angry. She looked hurt. Not guilty. Not remorseful. Just hurt. You've changed, she said quietly. Ever since you moved out, it's like you think you're better than this family. I felt something flicker inside me, maybe it was sadness or disappointment. Maybe both. No, I said. I didn't change. I just stopped pretending that any of this was normal. Dad leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and suddenly the emotion was gone from his face. Now he looked like he was closing a business deal. Fine, he said. You don't want to pay the full amount? Let's negotiate. I'm willing to lower the total if you agree to contribute something. I blinked at him. Did he actually believe this was reasonable? Or was he just trying to squeeze whatever he could get? And that's when I understood they never expected me to push back. They thought I'd cave. Pay up to keep the peace. They still saw me as that quiet, obedient kid who did the work while Brian got the applause. But I wasn't that kid anymore. I straightened my back and met his eyes head-on. I'm not negotiating, I said. I'm not paying a damn cent. Dad's jaw locked up. Mom's eyes welled up. Brian muttered something, but I didn't bother to listen. I picked up my phone, pushed my chair back, and stood. This conversation's over, I said, and without another word, I turned and walked out the door. I figured they'd let me leave. Maybe shout something behind me. Maybe toss in one last guilt trip for good measure, but ultimately I thought they'd let me walk away. But just as my hand touched the doorknob, Dad's voice came from behind me, sharp and low like a warning. If you walk out that door, he said, you're cutting yourself off from this family. I froze, not because I was second-guessing anything, but because that moment felt familiar. Like déjà vu. This was how they always kept me in line. By convincing me I had to earn my place in the family. That if I didn't follow their rules, I'd be cast out. Unwanted. Alone. But the truth was, I'd already been alone for years. I turned my head just a little, glancing back over my shoulder. I think we both know, I said softly, that happened a long time ago. And with that, I stepped outside and let the door close behind me with a soft click. I sat in my car for a few minutes, just staring blankly at my phone. The screen lit up, first a call from Mom, then a text from Dad. I didn't answer either. What did they expect? That I'd turn around and pretend none of that had just happened? That I'd apologize and hand them a check like this was all perfectly normal? Instead, I dropped my phone onto the passenger seat and fired up the engine. I was barely out of the driveway when another text came in. This one was from Brian. "You're being ridiculous. Just pay them something and move on." I scoffed and flipped the phone face down without even reading the rest. Of course Brian would say that. He didn't see the problem, never had. To him, throwing a little money at the situation probably seemed like the easiest fix. But I knew better. If I gave them anything now, it wouldn't end there. It would only open the door for more demands, more manipulation, more control. And still, despite everything that had just gone down, I felt that old, familiar pull of guilt creeping back in. That tiny voice whispering maybe I was being too harsh. But I shut that voice down quick. This wasn't them asking for help. They weren't struggling and turning to me in desperation. They were demanding payment. Like I owed them something. Like I was a transaction, not a son. And the worst part? They'd never, not in a million years, expect Brian to pay them back for anything. That alone was enough to smother the guilt. The whole drive home, the conversation played on a loop in my head. Every word, every smug look, every shift in Dad's expression like he was still calculating how to get what he wanted. By the time I parked in front of my apartment, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't just walking away from this. I was going to make damn sure they never tried to pull something like that again. I dropped my keys on the counter and grabbed my laptop. Started digging through old files, bank records, text messages, anything that could help piece together what they'd taken over the years. Didn't take long before I found it. There it was, a direct deposit into their account. 15 grand. Labeled temporary help. Then a message from Mom just a couple days later. "Thank you so much. We'll pay you back soon. Love you." And after that? Radio silence. No follow-up. No repayment. Nothing. I kept digging. Scrolling through years of bank statements. And then I saw it. A big withdrawal from my personal savings, the one I had built from scratch over years of grinding. Wiped clean in one transaction. They said they were borrowing it. That Brian needed help getting on his feet. That they'd return it once he was stable. That was 8 years ago. I leaned back in my chair, tapping my fingers against the desk. The deeper I went, the clearer it became. They had taken thousands from me. Not as gifts. Not as a family pulling together. But under false promises, pretending it was temporary, acting like I'd get it back. They drained my inheritance. Lied to my face. And now? Now they had the nerve to act like I owed them? My jaw tightened. Fine. If they wanted to play games, I'd play. I wasn't going to beg for my money. I knew they'd never give it back willingly. But I had something else, leverage. I spent the next few hours compiling everything. Every transfer. Every receipt. Every temporary message. I organized it all into a neat little folder on my desktop. Labeled it something simple but sharp, family finances. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I picked up the phone and called my uncle. Uncle Dennis, my mom's older brother. He was one of the few people in the family I still had some trust in. He and my parents never really saw eye to eye. But more importantly, he'd been the executor of my grandfather's estate. When he answered, his voice was warm but cautious. "Hey, kid. Been a while." "Hey, Uncle Dennis," I said, trying to sound casual. "Listen, I have a quick question about Grandpa's will." There was a long pause. Then a sigh. "I was wondering when you'd ask," he said. My stomach sank a little. "So, you knew?" "Not everything," he admitted. "But yeah, I knew your parents took the money that was meant for you. Your grandfather left equal amounts for you and Brian." I sat there in silence. When I followed up about it, he continued, "Your mom told me you'd agreed to let them manage your share." I let out a bitter laugh. Manage it? They drained it. Spent it on themselves and Brian. "That's low," Uncle Dennis said. "Even for them." I hesitated, then asked the question I'd been holding back. "Is there anything I can do?" He went quiet for a second. Then, in a lower voice, he said, "Actually, yeah, there might be." Turns out, since the inheritance had been designated for me specifically and I'd never signed anything giving them the right to touch it, I could go after them. Legally, it wouldn't be easy. I'd need a lawyer. It'd take time. But I had documentation, and that counted for a lot. I thanked Uncle Dennis, hung up the call, and stared at my laptop screen for a long minute. Then I picked up the phone again and called a lawyer, a referral from a friend. Someone who handled estate disputes. I explained everything, sent over all the documents. A couple days later, he got back to me with a simple response. "You have a case." It took a few weeks to get everything filed. In the meantime, I ignored the calls from Mom and Dad. Ignored Brian's passive-aggressive texts. Let them sit in their silence, thinking maybe I just moved on. Then came the legal notice. Served directly. That's when all hell broke loose. Mom showed up first. banging on my door like a hurricane, screaming the moment I opened it. How could you do this to your own family? I stayed calm. I'm just reclaiming what's mine. Then came Dad, this time by phone. His voice was low and controlled, like he was trying not to explode. You don't want to do this, he warned. But he was wrong. I did. Next was Brian, texting in all caps. You're actually insane. You're tearing this family apart over money. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Because here's the truth they didn't want to admit. I wasn't the one who tore this family apart. They did. They stole from me. Lied to me. Tried to squeeze more out of me like I owed them for being born. All I did was finally stand up and say enough. And now for once, they were the ones facing the consequences. Problem was, they didn't have the money to pay me back. In the end, we settled it in court. They didn't have the cash to pay everything back, so they had to start selling things off. That included their precious vacation timeshare, the one they used to brag about every holiday season. Gone. And Brian? Oh, he was livid. For the first time in his life, his little bubble of comfort actually got popped. Suddenly, things weren't so cushy for him anymore. They tried to lay the guilt on thick too. Tried to twist the narrative and paint me as the bad guy who tore the family apart over a few dollars. But here's the thing about manipulation, it only works when you still care about what the other person thinks of you. And I didn't care anymore. That switch had flipped. So, this is where things stand now. My parents had to give up a good chunk of what they owned. They're still bitter about it, still stewing in their own version of events. They downsized their house. Sold the timeshare. Cut back on all those little luxuries they used to treat themselves to. Uncle Dennis told me they've been going around telling extended family I sued them over some misunderstanding and wrecked their lives over money. Real convenient, leaving out the part where they stole from me first. Brian? He's not speaking to me. Not that I expected anything different. Last I heard, he was still whining to anyone who'd listen about how unfair I was, how I took it too far. Meanwhile, he's still got everything they gave him. Still living off the fruits of what they took from me. Never once offered to return a dime. And me? I finally feel free. No more guilt. No more pressure. No more wondering when the next ask or demand would show up in my inbox or come wrapped in a family dinner. For the first time in my life, I stood up for myself. Drew a line and didn't back down. Yeah, it tore a hole right through her family. And yeah, I know in their eyes I'm the villain in this story. The ungrateful son. The heartless one. But I don't regret a thing. Still, I can't help but wonder, does this make me the a-hole? Was it too much to take them to court? Was I wrong to force them to pay back what they took? Or was I justified in finally standing my ground? I'd really like to know what you think. And hey, if you've ever felt used or taken for granted by your own family, share your story in the comments. I'm sure I'm not the only one out there who's been through this. And if this resonated with you, go ahead and like, subscribe, and stick around. There are more stories like this coming.